Day, we'll sing through twice, 2 times. This is the day that the Lord hath made. I will rejoice and be glad in it, This is the day that the Lord hath made. I will rejoice and be glad in it. This is the day that the Lord hath made. This is the day that the Lord hath made, I will rejoice and be glad in it. Oh, this is the day that the Lord hath made. I will rejoice and be glad in it. Oh, this is the day that the Lord hath made. Amen. Please be seated.
Good morning. I got to tell you, I love the excitement that I see and feel every time more and more come through the doors, and so that's uplifting. I know some of you are here visiting maybe for the first time, and so I just want to say thank you for choosing to worship with us today, and I do hope that you'll come back and be a part of our time together again in the future. Many of you know that, and if you don't, you're about to. My wife's out of town. She's in Texas for 3 weeks, and I'm doing good. I will say yesterday I was well taken care of. I went to a birthday party and had lunch there, and I went to a wedding last night and had dinner there. So I'm just asking if any of you know of any birthday parties or weddings that are going on in the next 3 weeks I could crash. That would be awesome. So that was really fun. So I want to follow up just a little bit this week on my message from last week, which had to do with praise through serving. I mean, clearly by the excitement and by people coming and worshiping together, that our time of really kind of hibernation is over, and it's really time to get back and get on fire for God again. And so, as we sang that song, "This is the day that the Lord hath made," well, that's my thoughts for today, is this is the day. And this is the day that the Lord hath made. And what does that mean really to you and I? You've all heard the expression, the good old days. And maybe you've even said that at times. Oh, I wish for the good old days. I heard that on the radio yesterday even. I was like, okay, well, that's some divine intervention coming through. And so, whether it has to do with our childhood years and we're thinking back to those, or our teen years, or maybe just a certain time in our country where we wish for those days to come back, or maybe a time in the Lord's church where we might say, oh, those were the good old days, or even a time in this church we might say, oh, those were the good old days. I wish they would come back. Well, that's okay, but too often I think what we do is those are really snapshots in time. They're not all the big picture that comes along with that. And we tend to forget about everything else. We just focus on those really good things in that moment in time. And I'll give you an example. I could think back and say, the high school years for me were the best days of my life. I wish I could go back to those good old days. Because, after all, I got good grades. I had lots of friends. I didn't have a lot of responsibilities. My life was pretty much go to class, play basketball, run track, get more girlfriends, those kind of things. That was it. I really miss those days, and I could say that, but then I start to thinking, do I really mean that? You see, because within those good old days, there were some things that weren't really quite so good. Mom and Dad were great, but they made me eat salmon cakes. And, I've told you before about my dislike for Spam, and they'd make us eat that and liver and onions and fried green tomatoes and hominy. And if you've don't even know what that is, don't find out. It's not good. But those are the things that come to mind. And then too, growing up like many, we had 3 channels on TV, that was all. There was no computer, no internet, no air conditioning at all. And then we lived in the country, and so our water came from the well, and the rule in our house was that, if you're going to take a shower, you turn the water on, you get wet, you turn the water off, you soap up, and then you turn the water on again, and you rinse off. Well, that was back in the old 2-knob system, where you tried to get a little H and a little C, and if you got too much H and not enough C, that was a problem, or too much C and not enough H. And so those were things that if I think about, I don't know that I want to go necessarily back to all of that. And I know for sure the wardrobe that I wore in high school, I would not want to repeat that today. I'll give you an example of my senior picture. I had a navy blazer, which was good. We still have those. Had a white pullover turtleneck. I had on maroon and white checked bell-bottom pants. I had a very wide white belt, and I had white shoes. And that was my senior picture, and I was looking good. Ron, I was looking really good. Where's Ron? Where are you, Ron? I know you're here. There you are. I was looking really good. I was styling and profiling, but I wouldn't want to do that today. I would not. And there's nothing wrong really with remembering the past. I mean, it's okay to remember the past, but to live in the past, that's not a good thing. It's not a good thing. It's a different story altogether, and that's really kind of the basis for some of the things I want to share with you today. You see, life isn't static. It's not stationary. It ebbs and flows just like the ocean. Someone moves in and someone else moves away, or someone passes away and someone else is born. Technology changes all the time. Societies change, whether good or bad. Change occurs. And so to live in the past really doesn't accomplish anything for us in the present or the future. It's interesting that Chris read from John 19, because my text for this week is actually John 20, beginning with the first verse. And so in John 20, there's really, while there could be an essence of hope for the good old days, which I'll talk about in a minute, really the importance of what I'm going to look at is the here and now. And that's what was going to be stressed, I think, in John chapter 20, the here and now. And that needs to be our focus even today as we try to live like God would have us to live and not dwell on those good old days of old. In John chapter 20, the first 9 verses, we have the account of the empty tomb. And John writes that Mary Magdalene, who had been mentioned in the scripture that Chris read in chapter 19, that John said she discovered the empty tomb. And so when she did that, she took off and she went to find the disciples. And so when she found Peter and John, she told them, she said, they have taken the Lord out of the tomb and we don't know where they have put him. And so we know from those first 9 verses of John 20 that Peter and John ran to that empty tomb and they discovered exactly what Mary Magdalene had told them, that the tomb was empty. And so after discovering that, they left, but Mary Magdalene stayed there. And I want to pick it up in chapter 20, verse 10, and just share a couple verses with you about what took place from that point on. So John chapter 20, verse 10, and I had it marked in 1 John from Bible class, and my wife wasn't here to set me straight, so there you go. You can tell her I missed her. Beginning of verse 10. Said, then the disciples went back to their homes, but Mary stood outside the tomb crying. And as she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb and saw 2 angels in white, seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. They asked her, woman, why are you crying? They have taken my Lord away, she said, and I don't know where they've put him. At this she turned around and saw Jesus standing but she did not realize that it was Jesus. Woman, he said, why are you crying? Who is it you are looking for? Thinking he was the gardener, she said, sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you've put him, and I will get him. Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned toward him and cried out in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. And Jesus said, "Do not hold on to me, for I have not yet returned to my Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them I am returning to my Father and to your Father and to my God and to your God." Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, "I have seen the Lord." And she told them that he had said these things to her. Now, if you're not sure who Mary Magdalene was, if you look in Luke chapter 8, the first 3 verses, it says that Mary Magdalene was a woman who had 7 demons taken out of her. And she was one of the women who traveled with Jesus and the 12 disciples. And in that group of women, they helped support Jesus and those 12 from money from their own pockets. And so there's no doubt that over the course of being with Jesus through his ministry, Mary Magdalene had developed a relationship with him to where she truly worshiped Jesus. And I'm sure that his crucifixion was devastating to her as she witnessed that. And then when she went to the empty tomb and saw that, I'm sure she was also just as devastated. But then, just as much as her feelings and her emotions were at a low, when she realized that Jesus was there and it wasn't the gardener, her emotions soared again. And so truly she was she thought maybe, just maybe, there's Jesus, everything is going to be just like it was before. He's back. He's here. And so her emotions were running really, really high. She started to go toward Jesus out of her enthusiasm, her excitement, her joy. And I'm sure she was running towards him to either throw her arms around him or to go down on his feet, at his feet and wrap her arms around his feet, thinking that, yes, he's back and things are going to be like they were. But you know, Jesus was going to signal something totally different. Even though Jesus, the epitome of love and compassion, didn't allow that to happen right then. In fact, you know, he told Mary Magdalene this. He said, "Do not hold on to me, for I have not yet returned to the Father." You know, things were not going to be as they once were. The trips from town to town, the miracles, the parables, the talks, just the association with Jesus and the 12, it was not going to go back that way. It was not going to be the good old days. In fact, he gave Mary an assignment for the present. He said this, he said, "Go instead to my brothers and tell them, I am returning to my Father and your Father, and to my God and to your God." You see, even though Jesus had been resurrected, his time on earth was still going to be very limited. And rather than dwell on the past, Jesus needed to use his time to focus on the present and to plan for the future. And so to spend time on the good old days wasn't something that was going to probably happen. Now, we just assembled and we just partake of the Lord's Supper, and it's right and it's good to remember the events that took place around Jesus' death and his burial and his resurrection. It's right to do that. But the story of Jesus challenges us to do more than just remember that. In fact, when we think about, and some of you will remember Paul Harvey's The Rest of the Story, which was on radio stations for years. Well, when it comes to the story of Jesus' life and his death and his resurrection, the story could have ended there, but it didn't. He didn't want it that way. God didn't plan it that way. You see, we play a role in what was to come. We play a role in what was to come. You see, because we are the rest of his story. We are. Jesus died, and he suffered and died, and he was resurrected so that his story would continue. And we are part of that story. We are the reason that he did what he did. And so to think about and to dwell only on the past in our lives gets nothing accomplished for us, for God's sake, for Jesus' sake, in the present. With limited time left on earth, when he did resurrect from the dead, he knew the importance of no longer dwelling on all those things. In fact, just before he went to heaven, just before he ascended back to heaven, he gave instruction to his disciples on what they were supposed to be doing from that day moving forward. He didn't tell them to go sit around and reminisce about all the three years that they'd spent together and just think about those things like we might a vacation that we took or our time in high school. He didn't want his disciples to just talk about the good old days and to remember the great times they shared. You see, the story didn't end with Jesus' ascension back to heaven either. He handed the pen and the paper to those disciples who were with him when he went to heaven, and he had them continue to write his story. And so if we look and we know that in Mark chapter 16, verses 15 and 16, Jesus gave them the Great Commission. And it said, "Go into all the world and preach the good news to all creation. Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved, but whoever does not believe will be condemned." And you know, as I look at that verse and I look at that part that says, "Go into all the world," something dawned on me. And that's this, that Machesney Park and Loves Park and Roscoe and Rockton and Rockford and Belvedere and Freeport and Stillman Valley and Winnebago and Pecatonica and Durand and Beloit and Janesville, they are also part of that world. In fact, they are our world. That's where we live. And we have the opportunity to continue the story that Jesus began back then in our part of the world, in those places I just mentioned. And there's nothing wrong at all with missionaries that take it other places as well, because that's part of it as well, because it says all the world. But we have opportunity here, because this is the day that the Lord has made, and we have an opportunity to share that news, that story of Jesus, even in our world around us. You know, too often I think we find ourselves caught up in that past and present. We find ourselves, really trying to cling to those good old days and remember those great times, but then what does that accomplish today? Unfortunately, a mindset like that rarely gets anything done today, because we're either find ourselves focusing on some past success, and we want to dwell on that, sitting around wishing for a return to those periods of time when things we think were so much better, or we're dreaming of days gone by. And those opportunities, when we're thinking about those things, opportunities are going to come, but they're going to sweep right past us. They're going to go by unnoticed because we didn't do what we should have done or could have done, because this is the day. We've missed those opportunities, holding on to regrets and hurts from the past, responding to them like saying, well, that's the way we've always done it. Or we tried that once and it didn't work, so we can't, let's not do that again. Well, all that does is hold us back and keep us from moving forward. It keeps us from possibly being the people that God would want us to be, if all we want to do is cling to the past. A few months ago, February in fact, I decided I needed to climb out onto the roof of our sunroom, because there was a good inch of ice on top of the roof, and then there were 18 inches of snow on top of that. And I was concerned about the weight that was going to be piling up, because if you remember in February, it seemed like every day it snowed. And so it was only going to get higher. And so I felt the need to kind of go out and clear off as much of that snow as possible. I didn't have a ladder to do that, so I took a 2-step stool, went up the upstairs bedroom, opened the window, and I attempted to climb out onto the sunroom roof. What I didn't take into account was that the level of the bedroom floor was a lot higher than the level of the roof. So as I put my left leg out of the window and tried to get it down onto the roof, the drop was significantly more than I'd anticipated. And I finally managed to get my tiptoes of my left foot onto the roof through the snow. But then as I tried to get my right leg through the window, it got stuck on the windowsill. So I'm sitting there, and yes, I was dumb because I was home alone, but I'm standing there on the roof, half of me kind of suspended between where I was and where I wanted to go. And I couldn't push up any higher on my left foot because I couldn't lift it any higher. I was barely hanging on as it was, and I couldn't lift my leg off of the windowsill, my foot off the windowsill. So there I was, kind of between where I wanted to be and where I'd been. And you think about that sometimes, and doesn't it seem like often we can sum up what happens when we keep clinging to the past while trying to find ourselves in the midst of the present, because we find ourselves being helpless. We find ourselves ineffective. We find ourselves stuck when we try to be in both places at the same time. Now, for what it's worth, I'm no longer on the roof. After a few minutes, I did manage somehow to get my foot up enough to fall into the snow on the roof and finish what I started. But there I was. And I thought about that. I'm like, that's what happens if we try to straddle the good old days of the past and yet try to sit in the present. We don't get a whole lot done. We get stuck. You know, Jesus' appearance to Mary Magdalene and her instructions seemed to signal that things were not going to be the way they used to be. They were no longer going to be what was, but instead what was right now, the present. And so, we sang that song, "This is the day that the Lord hath made. I will rejoice and be glad in it. This is the day that the Lord has made." The Beatles made a song called "Yesterday," and they have probably a lot of money they made from that. But being a follower of Jesus, if all we do is think about the yesterdays, we do nothing for God in the todays. We accomplish nothing in the todays. And it doesn't do us any good to think of a song, or in our heads to go, well, 40 years ago, things were really good. Let's just sit back and think about that. Not worried about today, just living in the past, wishing I could make those moments last. Well, it just doesn't work for Christians to do that. Because that's not the mission that God gave us. That's not the mission that Jesus gave us when he said, go into all the world. He didn't say, linger on the past. This is the day that the Lord has made, and we are part of the reason that he not only made it, but he gave it to us. He gave this day to us to do with it as he would have us do, to make the most of this day. So, in closing, I want to kind of challenge all of us. What are we going to do with this day? This is the day, and here's what I want to challenge us individually and as a church to think about. This is the day I will live like Jesus lived. This is the day I will love like Jesus loved. This is the day I'll show others what God is all about. This is the day that I'll carry out the Great Commission. This is the day I'll continue what Jesus started. This is the day that I'll be the difference in someone else's life. This is the day I will proclaim that Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection changed me. This is the day I'll erase my negative attitude, my critical nature, my narrow-mindedness, my stubbornness, my lifeless faith. This is the day that I'm going to let go of past regrets and hurts so that Jesus can be alive in me and evident to all. And this is the day that we will rejoice and be glad. That we'll begin anew. That we will serve God and others continually as a church. That we'll be a light to our world. That we'll reach out to the hurting and the lonely. That we'll become a church that's on fire for the Lord. We can't blame the pandemic anymore. And even though the virus is out there still, that obstacle is gone. It's time that we become a church on fire for God again. And so, a couple last thoughts. Jesus' love isn't contained just in his death, burial, and resurrection. Jesus' love continues because of his death, burial, and resurrection. It continues even today. This is the day. Jesus did what he did so we could show others what he did. We can't do that if we live in the past. This is the day that the Lord has made. I will rejoice and be glad in it. So let's let our joy be known to all through our obedience, through our faith, through our life, through our renewed spirit, through our service, as we, each of us, as we write the next chapter in Jesus' story here in our world. Thank you.